Fintech Chatter Podcast, brought to you by Tier 1 People, the leaders in executive search for fintech ventures.
Chad, great to finally get you on Fintech Chatter. I've been hustling you for I think a couple of years now.
Yeah, I think it's been about 5 years of like, yeah, let's do it next week, and it's just somewhere
It
kicked
has.
down the road.
It has. Yeah. But mate, awesome to have you here. Really excited for this one because there's a lot of stuff that we're going to cover that I think is really relevant, and I'm sure everybody's itching to hear about your Revolut experience. But no, it's an interesting time for marketers. I think it's probably one of the kind of disciplines that seems to be most at threat from AI and the promise of that. You're, without doubt, kind of hands down the kind of pin up for marketing and growth marketing. Whenever I'm talking to clients, and they kind of ask for examples, and what you did at Revolut is just, it's kind of, it's incredible. But we'll hear more about that. But before we do, what have you been doing since Revolut?
Good question. I think maybe the first sort of year of leaving Revolut, people often forget. One thing that's not spoke about enough is when you have the privilege of working for a company like Revolut, one of these rocket ship experiences that are so far and few, right?
Yeah.
It's really hard to think, what do I do next? Because on one hand, you want that same intensity and that same success that you've had over the last 5 or 6 years, and you have to be a bit of a Houdini to guess what's the next big thing and which company will take off. On the other side, you're often pressured to start your own thing because a lot of people aren't sure where to go next, or they're fed up of working with someone. And I found myself torn between the two, where very fortunately, I had no shortage of companies seeing that I was leaving and saying, let's have a call and let's speak, but not being really convinced by any of them. And then on the other hand, really wanting to do my own thing, but not trying to rush it, really trying to ensure that I nail down the right idea and I don't become what I call a tourist in the tech industry, which is bouncing from buzz to buzz, right? You go from fintech to AI to super fast grocery delivery, which so I sort of did a lot of advising and investing, which sort of took up most of my time across various different companies and spaces. And then finally, blockchain was always an area that I really wanted to go into. For me, it was the next step, the sort of next level of intensity in fintech, if you will, because, the reality is, while fintech's been amazing, it hasn't really changed anything, right? I know that's quite a bold thing to say, but the way banking operates is still the same, right? Most of these fintechs are just doing things faster, cheaper, more slicker, but the actual structures and systems remain the same. So when you look at blockchain,
I was going to say, like, if I look at Revolut, it's one of the few examples where I think genuinely they've actually changed the product for a customer, whereas 90% of what I've seen, I think, has been the innovation might be in the back end and is making a bank operate more efficiently, but as a customer, I'm still getting the same crappy products.
Yeah, 100%. I think what Revolut's sweet spot was it's kind of the strapline we came up with before I left, which was, one app, all things money. It was taking that Asian super app model and bringing that experience to the West. So I think what Revolut did is, again, nothing really changed. It was still working behind the scenes, pretty much similar to most financial companies, but it was that user experience and sort of bringing everything into one. But, then I found myself wanting to go into blockchain, which is just a whole nother level of complex. The entire system is different. It really aligned with my views of being permissionless, being open, and, people having a sense of financial freedom. So for me, it was more like, this is truly exciting technology. It's still such an unknown space in its early sort of stages. So it seemed like the right kind of mental challenge that I wanted.
I want to talk a little bit earlier of your career, because I think it's really interesting to see the journey that you've gone on. And, one thing that really kind of struck me was your kind of first gig, which was doing work in government and kind of politics. What do you want to tell us a little bit about that first role and kind of maybe how that kind of helped shape some of the the kind of strategies and things that you would have gone on later on in your career?
Yeah, basically, I think like most people in politics, I had a chip on my shoulder. I was over opinionated, and politics was the right place to go. But I think the reality is, when I was younger, I was always kind of really interested in politics and kind of assumed that's the route I wanted to go down. Right, I enjoyed having arguing and fighting matches with people at college and university and things. And then quickly realized it probably wasn't for me, actually. I think the bulk of my role was very sort of boring. It was a lot of press and media relations. It was a lot of public sort of outreach, focus groups, all that kind of stuff, listening to people's concerns, feeding that into communication channels for legislation. And I very quickly realized I'm quite a creative person. I'm someone who thinks outside of the box, and politics is not a place where people typically like to think outside of the box, right? Everything for me was just a bit slow paced, a bit stale, very predictable, the sort of playbooks of the 1950s, right? And it just sort of hit me one day that actually I love technology, and coupled with that, I'm pretty good at this old marketing thing, right? So I wanted my first sort of break. My first break into the marketing world and into the tech world was actually at Rocket Internet. For anyone who doesn't know, it's kind of a $100 billion incubator which spins out copycat companies and scales them all over Europe and Asia. And worked on a couple of companies there. One notable was called Helpling, which was basically like TaskRabbit, so you could hire cleaners, handymen, gardeners from the app, like the Uber for household services, basically, and took that across Europe. It was in UK, Germany, France, Italy. Then we took it over to Australia, and then we also took it over to Singapore as well. So quite an exciting first gig to be kind of thrown in the middle, straight into a sort of growth marketing role, and then straight into a international company as well, sort of taking the business into, for me, very strange markets, that I'd never had any experience with. So that was my first sort of draw in, and I was very fortunate that it was the kind of, Rocket Internet kind of had a very similar culture to Revolut, where it's a very data-driven KPI environment. You get really pushed into the deep end and kind of a lot of responsibility from day one. So it kind of set me up pretty well, actually, for going into Revolut, especially at those early days.
Yeah. Correct me if I'm wrong, but was Revolut 25 people when you joined?
Yeah, it was somewhere in that mid-20 range. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So what was it like? And I guess first of all, kind of taking your mind back, like what got you excited about going to a business that was 20 odd people, hadn't really proven itself? How many customers did they have at this point?
God, I mean, the first thing I'll say is the word customers, right? So Fintech has an issue with saying users, and what they actually mean is downloads and bots and signups.
Yeah.
In terms of genuine customers, people that actually ordered a card and made a payment and were using it daily, weekly, or monthly, it was probably in the region of 50K. So not a bad amount, but again, it was still a very mishmash consumer group, in the sense of like most people weren't using it very frequently. It was just being used by a niche of like air stewards and people who work in the sort of aviation industry. But it was definitely that sort of a good learning of clearly, what the product market fit was and who the target user was at that early stage.
That's really fascinating, actually, that was the kind of core group of users.
Yeah, I mean,
because you would think from the marketing that it was all kind of millennials who were traveling all the time. And
it's funny because when I joined Revolut, one of the first questions I was asked was, "What is the strategy?" Right, which fair enough, because there was no one doing it. Right, there was just Revolut was mostly interns at that point who were just getting their hands dirty. They were fresh grads and trying many things. So I was the first kind of dedicated person to come in and lead that function. And for me, the strategy was clear from day one. And I remember it not actually going down very well with people, because a lot of people internally had this view that, Revolut was the Amazon of banking, and we should be going after this banking user and competing with the likes of Monzo, Starling, N26. And I had to make the point of, Well, firstly, they all have bank licenses, we don't. Secondly, they all have bank-like features like direct debit, standing orders, things you need in banking, and we don't. So why are we going to fight for this very small niche audience where we cannot compete with them from a product perspective, and we do not have the assurance of saying to people that we're a legitimate bank, and your money's protected and all the rest of it. So I made this call of saying, whether we like it or not, until the product catches up, we are a travel company, right? We are going to say travel abroad with no fees, and transfer money abroad with no fees. It's going to be plain English, not sexy, because there's a huge market to sweep up, particularly in Europe, with the issue of cross borders and currencies, and being the biggest travelers in the world as well. And that's how Revolut kind of there's a big strategy behind it, but that's how it really did sort of strive to take over those people in the early days, because we were far more razor focused on a clear target user, where we had a very minimal competitive landscape and a very good solution for their problems.
Yeah. It's an example that I use, I think, pretty much all the time when people say, what's the best example of a growth business? And I'll either point to Revolut and Afterpay, because I think they both did two very similar things. Revolut pointed and said, hey, if you're a millennial and you go traveling every weekend and you're getting stung for fees every time you go, use this card, right? You won't get stung for fees. And Afterpay's was similar in that, hey, if you want to look like this on Saturday night and you don't have a credit card, we can help you look like that. And then to merchants, it was, hey, look, if your sales are going like that on a Saturday and you want to see them do that, try this out. And I think it was, obviously the execution of it was critical, but I think it was just the simplicity of the messaging and who it was targeted to. But I think that's one of the kind of real, things that really still stays with me about the Revolut journey, was just that simplicity in the early days of just being so targeted on what they were doing.
That's it. I mean, just because it's so easy in the marketing world to get lost in, we need to be doing 100 things at once, right? We need to be competing with every single person out there. And the best marketers, in my opinion, are the ones that just take a breath, look at the market, look at the data, and think, actually, what's step one? And how will step one lead to step two? And too many go in with that more sort of messy strategic mindset. And I think often that's what does not serve them very well. So we knew our strengths, we knew our weaknesses, we knew who the right target user was, we knew the right channels in terms of how to acquire those people, the right positioning and messaging to really resonate with them. And then we started to sort of build from there. So it wasn't just about buzzy millennials in big cities who travel all the time. For me, it was also thinking about the future of, who are going to be the users that will actually make you money. And that's typically an older demographic, right? Let's say the 35 plus market. And there's huge expat communities that live in Spain and Dubai and Australia. So it was also, we did a really good job of not just focusing on home turf and getting those people, but thinking about all the Brits abroad who are sending money back home to pay for mortgages in the UK or their kids' schools, or they're frequently traveling.
Well, all my family in the UK have got Revolut cards, but they didn't have them until I had a Revolut card and said, "You got to check this out, right?" And I think what it's still, and it sounds so simple now, but 5 years ago, Chad, my mum couldn't send. Now she'll send a text, right? There's 10 quid. Kids on school holiday has gone buy them an ice cream, right? She couldn't do that in the past.
Yeah.
And it's just those little things, right, where you think, it kind of doesn't, but it actually means a lot to my mum, right? And I think the amount of money I've saved on fees, it's like, it literally is in the thousands.
Yeah, I mean, often I hear, I had a friend once who, he saved thousands in fees. He lives abroad. He's still got a place in London. He's got a mortgage to pay. He uses Revolut constantly. And then he was complaining to me about, the price of his metal plan. And I went through with him, and I sort of mental math worked out roughly just that month how much he'd saved in fees. And it was about 10x the cost of what he was paying for a plan. And then he really saw the value. And it's one thing I actually sent feedback over to Revolut recently, where I was like, you guys really have to start sending like a monthly summary where you just show people in plain black and white how much you've saved them that month. Because it's not good enough to just make them try and figure it out for themselves, or just to say high level statements like, we save you money. Like, show them the value. And then when they see that in pounds and dollars and euros, they're going to be far more incentivized to scream and shout about you, tell their friends and family, put a
Yeah.
post out there. So it's something they're still not doing. It was a mistake of mine. I should have done it when I was at the helm, and they're still not doing it.
Yeah. So 50,000 customers when you joined, 10 million when you left. I want to talk about that journey to the first million, because that must have just been like, kind of one of those moments in life where, I think of that movie, the, Social Network, about Facebook, when they get to, what is it, a million or a billion customers or whatever, and they've got the ticker kind of going down. That must have been just like unbelievable to see that number hitting.
Do you know, I'll be entirely honest with you. It didn't really have much of an impact on me or my emotions. And maybe that's just because we are heartless robots and, our emotions have been sucked out of us. But I think the reality is it was just so ingrained to be grounded at Revolut, in the sense that, like, we're still getting started. There
Yeah.
wasn't room to be complacent and say, great, we've made it, we've got 10 million users. The reality was, not all of those users were as active as we wanted them to be. Not all of them were making us any money. Not all of them were referring friends. So I actually looked at that number and saw more problems than I did solutions. So it was definitely a moment where you have a drink that night and you all kind of
Yeah.
celebrate, but it's very case of like, tomorrow, forget about it.
Yeah.
We're moving on. There's loads more to do. And I should say it was, when I was leading the helm, so when I was the one making the decisions, it was 10 million. I stayed at Revolut, I think, another year after that, where I sort of just kind of got to do what I wanted to do, sort of thing. It was like, shall we say, early retirement.
Yeah.
And when I left, the company was 20 million users. So
Yeah.
that system that we built, which was me and our my head of growth at the time, which was Val Scholes, who's incredible and you should speak to as well. We basically built this system that was just automated and the cog was moving. And within a year, or just over a year, I think it was, there was nearly 10 million users.
Oh, mate, I remember it, right? Because I was actually helping you guys with the CEO role for Australia. And at the time, it was 4 million customers. And by the time we got Matt signed up, which was, I think, November. So this was the April. I remember Easter we were talking. And then by November, it was 10 million customers. And I was like, what? Is this a typo? Right? It was just unbelievable.
It was stressful as well. Like it's easy to sit there and talk about the highs and put out buzzwords and say 10 million, 20 million. But the reality is, behind the scenes, it's actually more stressful, because on one hand, you're growing so rapidly that everyone's watching you, right? The regulators are watching you, your partner banks, any partners you use, they're all sat there thinking, God, can we handle this? Do we still want to maintain this? Do we need to be keeping a closer eye on them? Growth's doing its job. At the same time, our other internal departments in the company scaling with that demand, whether it's customer support, compliance, risk. And then on a marketing side, again, any good marketer won't get carried away with vanity metrics like, user numbers. And you got to think about, how do they define a user? Is it a real user, or is this just cheap shit acquisition that they've been bringing in? And then you've got that whole other stress head of like, okay, now we need to think about activation, retention, revenue, and how and that journey those users go on. So, definitely an amazing buzz and a great success, of course. But there's so much more that doesn't get spoken enough about around sort of you get it.
Yeah, and I remember that at the time there was the whole kind of Revolut Monzo thing, and there was a big love in with Monzo and a big hate in with Revolut, and I couldn't understand it, to be honest. And the reason why I couldn't understand it was that everything that I was seeing and hearing and coming from Revolut was just transparency and authenticity, and it's like, look, this is who we are. Like, we're on a mission. Like, you either like it or you don't, right? Whereas I felt like with Monzo, it was kind of trying to kind of always appease to everybody and like do stuff to kind of be cool, rather than actually this is like the super focus that Revolut had.
Do you know, you nailed it, because I obviously oversaw the communications team, so we had to deal with all the crisis and the reputation stuff, and there's many reasons why. I think one, the media always, the UK media are probably among the worst in the world in terms of building people up and tearing them down. It doesn't matter whether it's British companies or celebrities or whoever. Sadly, that is the toxicity that exists in
Yeah.
our media
Did
industry.
your kind of very first job come in handy then when you were doing
Very.
like PR and crisis comms?
I mean, everyone at Revolut knows how hands-on I was on the PR and comms
Yeah.
side. Far more than I am today. And it was needed because every week there was a new fire that had to be put out. But the other hand was Revolut, like there's not many Revoluts in Europe, and especially in the UK. We don't build big global tech companies like the US do, and there's many
Yeah.
reasons for it. Some will say regulation and all this kind of stuff, funding. For me, one of the main reasons is we just don't work as hard as the US.
Yeah.
We are so overly obsessed with this idea of like, culture and being super nice. And Revolut just kind of made this point clear, which is, we do have a culture that is more akin to, a football team, which
Yeah.
is that the highest performers will stay and the lowest ones will move somewhere else. Right. And the coach
Yeah.
has to be tough and on top of you. And, Nick purely created a culture where he wanted people to work hard, but they would be highly rewarded in terms of their positions
Yeah.
in the company, their
Yeah.
remuneration, their shares in the company. And he didn't try and hide it. It was out there plain to see. So you knew exactly whether it was for you and for it's not. And I
Yeah.
often meet a lot of these culture and HRE type people who are trying to have these horrible playbooks implemented in every company everywhere.
Yeah.
And for
The
me,
Netflix playbook, and it's like, look, we're not
it's like
Netflix, right?
the beauty
Yeah.
of startups is that every company is different. I
Yeah.
love the fact that the culture can be anything, right? And there's
Yeah.
not some preset, sort of rules of this
It's
is what your
and
culture
it's
has to be.
organic, right? Like every person that comes in kind of adds and changes the kind of dynamic of the culture, right? It's
Yeah.
like almost like an living organism that, feeds off things and kind of evolves.
100%. And at the end of the day, a lot of people can sit there and say, okay, that doesn't align with me. And that's absolutely fine. That's good, right? That means right? And it's not the kind of environment for you. And then there's a lot of people out there that would, completely attack it and say, this is not the right way to run a company. Yet Revolut is a very profitable, biggest success story, probably in European tech. It's a prime sort of evidence that, yes, actually, that is a culture of success. You might not like it. And I'm not saying there aren't other models that can work. But it doesn't mean you get to shout it down and say it's wrong just because it doesn't fit your narrative.